Thank you very much. First of all, how are you holding up? All right? We just had a panel on resilience just before this one, and we've concluded that, what true resilience actually is being able to sit through 129 panels and still be awake for the very finale. Yes. So the thing with these conferences is that we usually leave the best stuff for the finale. And here it comes. So it's my absolutely greatest pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Patrick Salmon, who is the Chief Historian of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office here in London. And he's going to talk about Churchill and the Baltic. Now, a few words about Patrick. Before taking up his present position, he was Professor of International History at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. His publications include, first and foremost, if you're a historian, you of course know this little book, which was published in 1991, and it's called The Baltic Nations in Europe, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the 20th Century. And this was actually probably one of the first, if not the first, history of the Baltic states in English after the breakup of the Soviet Union. In addition to that, he did it, by the way, with the late John Hayden, who is no longer with us. In addition to that, he also published Scandinavia and the Great Powers from 1890 to 1940, Deadlock and Diversion, Scandinavia and British Strategy during the Twilight War from 39 to 40, and The Control of the Past, Herbert Butterfield and the Pitfalls of Official History, which was just recently in 2021. He also edited several volumes in the series Documents on British Policy Overseas, or DBPO, including on German unification from 89 to 90, the Nordic countries, 2 volumes on UK South African relations, and the Lancaster House Conference and the Independence of Zimbabwe, which is still forthcoming. Now, when historians see Patrick, they are jealous. Not only he's the historian of the Foreign Office, not only he's sitting literally 2 inches away from all the cool stuff, from all the cool archival material, he's the first to touch all that cool stuff once it gets declassified and made available for the masses. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Patrick Salmon.
Thank you, Donatus. That was a very kind introduction and extremely flattering. I've been working on the Baltic and on Churchill actually for half a century. It's hard to believe. And a lot of what I'm trying to do now is actually reconstruct things that I thought I knew a long time ago and since forgotten, so please excuse any confusions. But I did want to say, first of all, that among other things, Cambridge is a very good place to be talking about Churchill because, of course, it's the place where the Churchill Archives Centre is located in Churchill College, which is just on the outskirts of the city here. And I've been very grateful to the director, Dr. Alan Packwood, who's given me access to the Churchill papers online, and that is a fantastic resource. But there's also several hundred other wonderful collections of people who work with Churchill, and of course many people who've been prominent since, most notably Margaret Thatcher. So it's great to be here, and I just want to congratulate you really on what's clearly been a wonderful conference. I saw one session called How Can We Make the Baltic Studies Less Marginal? And I thought, well, gosh, you're a lot less marginal than when I started 30 or 40, 50 years ago. So, be grateful for what you've got. I should say one more thing, and that is that nothing I say this evening represents the official view of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office or of Her Majesty's Government. I am, of course, speaking in a purely personal capacity. And I'll start, if I may, by quoting from Winston Churchill from the first volume of his History of the Second World War, The Gathering Storm, published in 1948. I'll quote, "Called to the Admiralty again in 1939, I could not rest content with the policy of convoy and blockade. I sought earnestly for a way of attacking Germany by naval means. First and foremost gleamed the Baltic." Well, with those words, Churchill was introducing his plan to send a heavily armoured naval force into the Baltic, Operation Catherine, named, he said, after Catherine the Great, because Russia lay in the background of my thought. And I think that'll be a theme we'll be coming back to quite a bit. First and foremost gleamed the Baltic, yet as far as I know, Churchill never actually saw the Baltic Sea, gleaming or otherwise. Yet this inland sea repeatedly gripped his strategic imagination as a place with the potential for decisive action against Germany in both world wars, and also as a way to engage with Russia, the other great power of the region, on which his views were much more ambivalent. And in the course of the lecture, I'll try to show how these contradictory impulses, centering on the Baltic, played out over the central decades of Churchill's life. Well, first, let's get an idea of the periods in which the Baltic was at or was close to the centre of Churchill's attention over the central decades of his life. There are 5 periods really in all, and I'll just run through these slides so you can see them. They'll be the background to everything that comes later. And we see him first as First Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the greatest navy the world has ever seen, seeking ways to bring naval power to bear directly on Germany and aiming primarily at the Baltic, well into the First World War, until, of course, disastrously sidetracked by the Dardanelles. We then see Churchill as Secretary of State for War, recovering his political career after being in the doldrums. There were several doldrums, of course, in Churchill's career. At this point, his primary objective is to destroy Bolshevism in Russia on as many fronts as possible, including the Baltic. And here we have him complaining to his colleagues of how indecisive they were in not encouraging an attack on Petrograd by the one Baltic figure he did know very well, and most of you will recognize him, of course, General Mannerheim of Finland. Then we have the period of, starting in 1936 really, when Churchill's in the political wilderness and has now identified Nazi Germany as Britain's principal threat. Again, he looks at the Baltic, and he does so again when becoming First Lord of the Admiralty at the beginning of the Second World War in September 1939. So once again, we have this idea of sending the Navy into the Baltic, but also, very importantly, dealing with Russia. And in this period, Finland is the chief obstacle. Now we have Churchill's Prime Minister in alliance with Russia for the first time, and seeking to deal with Stalin's demands for a wartime alliance and a post-war settlement in which Finland, the Baltic states, the Danish Straits all figure as bargaining chips. And here you'll see an interesting transition from 1942, when he's standing up for the independence of the small states, and 1944, when he realizes, actually, there is nothing we can do. Suddenly, the Russians are rather more pleasanter people than we thought, and I admire Stalin very much, and anyway, they're there. We can do nothing about it. And then, of course, the one, I think, quotation that everybody will recognize, Churchill's Fulton speech of March 1946. Again, the Baltic figures from Stettin in the Baltic. And at this point, of course, he has firmly identified the Soviet Union as the major threat to Western security and the future of the West. To be fair, the Baltic at this point is not much more than a rhetorical device, and the Baltic does not really enter his consciousness again on a major basis until very, very late. You might have noticed my dates at the beginning, 1886 1887 to 1960. There's a sort of little trick there which I'll come to later. So we're looking at more than 30 years in which Churchill repeatedly returned to this part of the world. Of course, his attention wasn't continuous. You wouldn't expect that. He had many other things on his mind and many other jobs. At certain points, it became an obsession. At other points, it disappeared completely. And of course, Churchill, a man of supreme egotism and ruthless ambition, was never known for his consistency. But in the course of this lecture, I hope to identify a number of questions and try to answer them. The obvious one first is why? Why was Churchill repeatedly drawn to the Baltic? What was he trying to achieve? The second question that's occurred to me really as I was writing this lecture was actually how well did he know the region? What did he know about it, about its peoples, its history, its geography? Then Russia keeps coming back. Where did Russia fit into his geopolitical vision? Then there's the question you have to ask, could any of his ambitious schemes have actually succeeded? I will try to answer that one. But the suspicion must always be that they were there mainly for action's sake. Finally, however, I will return and take Churchill seriously and ask, was he right or wrong to attach so much importance to the Baltic? Well, the first question is a long one. It'll take me most of the lecture to answer. Why the Baltic? And I think you can work out already the sorts of things I'll be talking about, because there are two main themes, two fundamental purposes that drew Churchill to the Baltic over this 30-year period. One was to defeat Bolshevism, the other was to defeat Germany. And of these two, the former, in the form of anti-communism or anti-socialism, came first chronologically and was perhaps more fundamental, because Churchill was, after all, a man of his time and of his class. He was conservative, he was aristocratic, he was an imperialist. He was an anti-socialist before Bolshevism existed. The British Labour movement certainly remembered Churchill in the role of class warrior at Tonypandy in 1910, when he did not, in fact, order the troops to fire on striking miners, but the troops were certainly there. And we might also remember the Baltic dimension of the siege of Sydney Street very shortly afterwards, when he did call troops in to deal with what was called a gang of Lettish anarchists. Lettish, of course, means Latvian anarchists. Holed up inside number 11, and they'd already shot a couple of policemen. And then, of course, Churchill, there are many photographs most people have seen of Churchill hiding behind the wall, watching the proceedings as the troops moved in. But in the Baltic context, Churchill's anti-communism was confined primarily to the period I've referred to earlier, that is 1919 to 1920, when he was urging his colleagues to support the anti-Bolshevik forces in the Far East, in South Russia, in North Russia, and in the Baltic, of course, and largely without success, despite or perhaps because of the vehemence of his rhetoric. During this period, we've seen already he made common cause with one noted anti-Bolshevik figure from the Baltic region, General Mannheim of Finland, whom he later called a real man underlined, strong as a rock. And he dealt with Mannheim repeatedly, actually, over the interwar period as well, right up to the point at which Britain regretfully declared war on Finland in 1941. Together, Churchill and Mannheim advocated no fewer than 3 separate attempts to launch an assault on Petrograd from Finnish territory, each time thwarted by the caution of Allied leaders and Finnish parliamentarians. But, as was so often the case with Churchill, already from 1920, his attention was turning elsewhere. He had another job. The Bolsheviks were obviously not going to be removed from power in any near future. So, if you don't mind, I'll spend much of the rest of the lecture talking about the Baltic and its role, in Churchill's mind, in the defeat of Germany. And the idea of a Baltic naval offensive came, I think, from one man, and that was Admiral Jackie Fisher, the great First Lord of the Admiralty of the early 20th century, who had actually retired as First Lord in 1910 by the time Churchill became First Sea Lord, by the time Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. But from 1911 up to the outbreak of war, the two men spoke and corresponded frequently on naval matters. Fisher had actually served in the Baltic in the Crimean War in 1854 as a 13-year-old midshipman, and had been present at the bombardment of the great fortress of Sveaborg, present-day Suomenlinna, outside Helsinki. So he knew the Baltic, and he'd served there again in a later Anglo-Russian crisis in the 1880s. And you can see the sort of advice he was giving Churchill. His handwriting is quite clear, but I've also tried to help by giving you the actual wording as best I can. And the sort of themes you see in that little note, and again I'm very grateful to the Churchill Archive Centre for giving it to me: Berlin accessible from the Baltic, submarines, defence of Denmark, St. Petersburg defenceless against German fleet. These are the sort of ideas that were percolating into Churchill's mind over this period. The problem for Churchill was that the Admiralty itself had very different views. It had already, the naval experts, as opposed to the naval amateurs like Churchill, had made up their mind already that it was too difficult and too dangerous to attack Germany. Any close attack on near the German coastline, and therefore they'd moved away in favour towards a distant blockade, which was of course a very easy thing for the British Navy to do, because of course they controlled all the main sea routes into Germany from the North Sea, the Channel, and so on. But Churchill found such defensive ideas thoroughly objectionable. Even before the outbreak of war in June and July 1914, he was ordering investigations into the seizure of bases in Denmark or southern Sweden or a German island or a Dutch island to control the entrances to the Baltic and prepare the way for a possible naval offensive into the Baltic itself. And then after the outbreak of war, already in August 1914, he was talking to the Russians about giving naval support to a Russian landing in Pomerania. Admiral Fischer's phrase was, "the German coast, only 90 miles from Berlin." This was the phrase over and over again that both Fischer and Churchill employed. And in November 1914, Churchill actually recalled Fischer to the Admiralty as First Sea Lord, 74 years old by that time. And Fischer seems to have revitalised Churchill's interest once again. In December, he told Fischer, as I quoted earlier, "The Baltic is the only theatre in which naval action can appreciably shorten the war. Denmark must come in and the Russians be let loose on Berlin." And on the same day, he revived an old Admiralty plan for an attack on Germany across the North Sea. If I can give you the sequence, it runs like this. Seize the German North Sea island of Borkum. Borkum is the most southerly of the German North Sea islands, just above the Dutch frontier. From Borkum, invade Schleswig-Holstein. Then you occupy the Kiel Canal and win Denmark to the Allied forces. Then you launch a naval attack through Denmark and the Kiel Canal into the Baltic. And from there, you make a military landing on the Pomeranian coast and march on Berlin, supported by Russians from the east. Well, Captain Richmond, the Assistant Director of Naval Operations, wrote on this proposal, and I quote, "It is quite mad. I have never read such an idiotic amateur piece of work as this outline in my life. It remains with the army, who I hope will refuse to throw away 12,000 troops in this manner for the self-glorification of an ignorant and impulsive man." Well, we'll come back to the feasibility or otherwise of such operations later on. And of course, precisely at this time, Churchill's colleagues, and indeed Churchill himself, were being drawn to an ostensibly much more attractive destination, the Dardanelles. It always seems easier to attack Germany from the south. It was the same in the Second World War, the so-called soft underbelly. Italy, well, not quite. Turkey was the equivalent in the First World War. But the importance of the Dardanelles, and the one that Churchill deliberately suppressed in his war memoirs, because he kept rewriting the drafts, was that he always saw this as secondary to the Baltic. Even as Allied forces became bogged down on the Gallipoli Peninsula, Churchill was ordering operations for an operation to encompass again the capture of Borkum, the closure of the mouths of the Jade and Elbe rivers, the entry into the Baltic, and what he called the decisive military stroke, the landing of a 500,000-man army at Emden. Well, I don't think the Allies had 500,000 men to spare from the Western Front at the beginning of 1915. By the middle of May 1915, Churchill had been swept from office by failure at Gallipoli, by Fisher's resignation, by the refusal of the Conservatives to work with him in the coalition. He was the price Asquith had to pay for bringing the Conservatives in. And again, one has to ask this question, how serious? How serious was all this? Because, of course, Churchill soon moved on to other things in the First World War and was soon engaged very heavily in trying to defend his conduct over the Dardanelles. We'll come back to the feasibility or otherwise of that scheme later, because it's time to jump forward 20 years or so in the process, jumping over Churchill's anti-Bolshevik campaign of 1919 and 1920, because it's time to look at his second great Baltic initiative and to observe almost exactly the same motivations and the same obstacles at work. The starting point this time is 1936, because by this time Churchill, of course, had identified Nazi Germany as the greatest immediate threat to British security. And he was also talking to Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador to London, who actually was illustrated in one of the photographs I showed earlier. And in April 1936, Churchill had a long conversation with Sir Maurice Hankey, who was Cabinet Secretary, and who, of course, had been at the centre of decision-making since before the First World War. And with Hankey, over dinner, he aired his latest idea, a fantastic idea, as Hankey put it, but in fact almost identical to the ideas of 1914, of sending a British fleet to the Baltic and keeping it there permanently based on a Russian port. Its mere arrival in the Baltic, Hankey said, with its menace to German communications, would be a severe shock to German opinion and put a stop to further mischief. Well, it is indeed a fantastic idea. But what's interesting is what Hankey also said. In view of the danger of Germany, Churchill has buried his violent anti-Russian complex of former days and is apparently a bosom friend of Monsieur Maisky. And clearly that relationship was valued by Stalin too, because from late 1938 onwards, Maisky was supplying him with detailed information on Soviet war plans on Stalin's orders. And that's another thing which isn't terribly well known, but can be discovered in the Churchill papers here in Cambridge. Well, that's 1936. Move forward a further 3 years, and then we're on the verge of war. And even again, Churchill comes back to the idea in a memorandum of March 1939, Memorandum on Sea Power, which he actually paraphrased for his memoirs later. He again spoke of the vital importance of the Baltic to Germany, Scandinavian supplies, he wrote, Swedish ore, and above all, the protection against Russian descents on the long, undefended northern coastline of Germany. Well, undefended? Yeah, but it's not that difficult to move reserves up to the coast from Berlin and so on. In one place, little more than 100 miles from Berlin, he says, again repeating the sort of Fischer theme. All this makes it imperative for Germany to dominate the Baltic. Here, therefore, and I quote again, was the sole great offensive against Germany of British sea power. Ardent officers, this is a nice Churchillian phrase, ardent officers should be sent to work for a year upon the problems of entering the Baltic and living there in indefinite ascendancy. Kronstadt presents itself as the chief base. Well, of course, by the time Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty for the second time in September 1939, the conditions for a Baltic offensive were even worse than they'd been a few months earlier. Denmark was, of course, not yet in German hands, but German air power could undoubtedly dominate the Danish Straits, while, of course, the Nazi-Soviet pact of the 23rd of August had made the Soviet Union effectively Germany's ally. The chance of establishing a base at Kronstadt was surely non-existent. Nevertheless, as we've seen, one of Churchill's first acts on resuming office was to set the Admiralty to work on Operation Catherine, the operation with which I began the lecture. And throughout the autumn of 1939, he retained the starting point, as he told Maisky, that the basic interests of Britain and the USSR do not collide anywhere. So, as he told Maisky, if the Baltic countries have to lose their independence, it's better for them to be brought into the Soviet state system rather than the German one. And he was annoyed at the Finns for their stubbornness in resisting Soviet demands. You have every right to demand that the Finns rectify the frontier on the Karelian Isthmus and give you a few islands in the Gulf of Finland. Well, of course, even at that time, he realized that if the negotiations went badly, there wasn't much prospect of his improvement in Anglo-Russian relations, and sure enough, the outbreak of the Winter War, the Soviet invasion of Finland on the 30th of November 1939 did prevent rapprochement, and it really helped put paid completely to Churchill's Catherine scheme. But there are also new possibilities, because aid to Finland could be combined with other schemes in Churchill's mind for action in Norwegian waters, to deny Swedish iron ore to Germany, and so on. It might also provoke German intervention that would open up a new front in the north, where Churchill believed the Allies held the strategic advantage. And since British troops would play little or no role in actually defending Finland, there was probably little chance of actually conflicting with Russia. Those schemes too came to nothing, because in March 1940, as we know, Finland was forced to make peace with Russia, and in April, Germany took control of Denmark and Norway. The Baltic was closed off for the duration of the war, and the disaster in Norway, of which Churchill was the principal architect, also did more than anything else to make him Prime Minister. We move finally then to the actual alliance with the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945, of course made possible by Hitler's launching Operation Barbarossa. Finally, Churchill has the alliance he wanted, and then, of course, he has to deal with Stalin. And we've seen already the ways in which he initially resisted the advice of the Foreign Office to recognize the absorption of the Baltic states in the Soviet Union, while 2 years later he said, well, actually, we have no choice, we have to do it. And then further compromises would follow right along the line, especially, of course, as regards Poland. And I think the Katyn massacre, discovered in 1943, followed by Stalin's failure to support the Warsaw Uprising, then, of course, revived all those anxieties and fears and suspicions that Churchill had suppressed for so long. Already, shortly before Germany's surrender in May 1945, he was expressing thoughts that would be repeated almost word for word in his Fulton speech just under a year later. He wrote of the tide of Russian domination sweeping forward. This, he said, will be an event which, if it occurred, would be one of the most melancholy in history. The Russian frontier would run from the North Cape in Norway, along the Finnish-Swedish frontier, across the Baltic, to a point just east of Lübeck. It would include all the countries and all the great capitals of Middle Europe. So very similar to what he said at Fulton. And then, of course, we have that heart-rending question he asked himself. And again I quote, "Will it be said of me that I was so obsessed with the destruction of Hitlerism that I neglected to see the enemy rising in the east? Will this somehow be my epitaph on everything I've done, from the Blitz, the Battle of Britain, and onwards?" Well, that in a way is the point at which I think I have to leave that first question, why the Baltic, hanging in midair, because we haven't really reached a conclusion, but it does at least show how much the Baltic was in his mind through much of this period. The second, I might go back to them actually if I can, as a reminder. The second question was, how well did he actually know the region? How well did he know its history, its geography, its peoples? Violet Bonham Carter once patronisingly remarked on the advantages of Churchill's lack of formal education. Remember, he went straight from Harrow into the army. To him, she said, everything was new. And Churchill himself once lamented to his mother, "My mind has never received that polish which, for instance, Oxford or Cambridge gives." And yet one can't say that he actually suffered much from his lack of a university education, because we know that despite that lack, he was formidably well read. He actually did a lot better at school than he subsequently claimed. There's this mythology, of course, that he was a dunce or treated as a dunce. He got quite good marks in history and quite good marks also in geography. And he did come to know a lot about the history and geography of the Baltic region. He had written the life of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, and in March 1937 he told a young Swedish diplomat, Gunnar Hägglöf, who mentions it in his memoirs, a young Swedish diplomat, an amusing story about Marlborough's visit to Charles XII of Sweden. He told Hägglöf, consulted the original documents, and he proudly claimed he had read Voltaire's Life of the King in both English and French. And I think we have no reason to doubt that. And when you read Churchill's voluminous memoranda on every possible subject, whether urging action against the Bolsheviks or against Germany, they do reveal an astounding grasp of detail, combined with wide vision, whether it be knowledge of the competing forces in revolutionary Russia, or the topography of the Baltic region, or the coastlines of Germany and Denmark, and the other states bordering on the North Sea and the Baltic. He has that in his head, he understands it. And he could go into quite a lot of detail at times. In 1943, for example, he made a detailed study of the Hanko region in Finland, knowing that it would constitute one of Stalin's demands at the Tehran Conference. Yet he barely knew the Baltic region, perhaps didn't know it at all through personal experience, in contrast to his extensive travels in other parts of the world. India, obviously, Africa, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, North Africa, and of course France above all. In his 3 years as First Lord of the Admiralty before the First World War, he spent a total of 8 months at sea, which is extraordinary. I got that from Mary Soames's biography of her mother, Clementine Churchill, who is a really good book. I recommend it. I've only just started looking at it recently. 8 months at sea on the Admiralty yacht Enchantress. There was a photograph right at the beginning of him on board ship. Yet in all those years, in all those months, he never entered the Baltic. Even Germany, as far as I can see, I hope people can correct me on these facts later, even Germany seems to have visited only twice before attending the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. In 1906, when observing army manoeuvres, and in 1932, when he was researching the life of Marlborough. He didn't visit Russia at all until he attended the wartime conferences in Moscow and Yalta. Thinking about other countries in the region, he did visit Norway in 1948. He visited Denmark in 1950. That seems to be all. So he never visited Poland, he never visited the Baltic states, he never visited Sweden or Finland. And it may be perhaps this very lack of direct experience that made it easier for him to make such sweeping assumptions and dramatic decisions. Because what's missing, it's hard to say really, to pin it down, what's missing is what might be described as a feel for the pulse of the region. Who lives there? How do they make their living? What are their fears and what are their aspirations? Churchill studied his maps, but never perhaps fully appreciated the physical geography, the sheer distances, the forests, the swamps, the mountains, the rock-bound shores and skerries, the harsh winters that made life, daily life, but also conducting warfare, so very challenging. Occasionally he might make some comment on the people actually living there, the Finns, for example, this dour northern people, as he put them once. And of course he did come to know one Finn quite well. We've talked about it already, General, later Field Marshal Mannerheim. But this cosmopolitan aristocrat had actually a lot more in common with Churchill and his world than with most of his fellow Finns. So again, you don't need to know a place intimately to be able to make sweeping assertions about it, and it might be easier if you don't. My next question is Russia, again. Where does Russia fit? What was his view of Russia? And I'm not going to be able to answer this, I don't think, completely, but I'll make some suggestions. Because with Germany, the matter is quite straightforward. Germany was an enemy that had to be defeated, twice over as it happened, in 2 world wars. With Russia, it was more ambiguous. Russia was a potential enemy too, but also a potential ally. And in any case, it was a power that could not be simply defeated by the means that Britain had at its disposal, which were primarily naval. Russia, of course, was short of coastlines. Russia is a land power. The sea power could not easily defeat the land power. It would always be there, and at best its potential menace could be contained, not eliminated. Churchill's ideal, in fact, was a strong Russia, as a force for stability, posing no threat to the British Empire in the Middle East, India, or the Far East, and acting as a counterbalance to Germany. As he told Maisky in 1937, a weak Russia presents the greatest danger for the cause of peace and for the inviolability of our empire. We need a strong, very strong Russia. That Trotsky, he's a perfect devil. He is a destructive, not a creative force. I'm wholly for Stalin. So it was to prevent the spread of anarchy in Russia as much as to prevent the spread of Bolshevism abroad that he urged intervention in 1919. And it was Stalin on whom he relied to maintain a stable Russia, and a Russia that would be a partner in fighting Germany and establishing a new world order. My next question, could any of these schemes have worked? Well, of course, Churchill was constantly held back by more cautious and, as he would have seen, less imaginative colleagues, more law-abiding colleagues. What if just once they'd been persuaded to do what he asked? Could General Mannerheim have marched on Petrograd in 1919 and joined up with other anti-Bolshevik forces to overthrow Lenin's regime in Moscow? Probably not, one has to say. Could a British fleet have forced its way into the Baltic in 1914 or 1915? Again, probably not, but if I may, I'll try and be charitable and try a bit of counterfactual history and suggest this is the one time it might possibly have worked. In 1914, after all, Britain still had a viable ally in Russia, a German navy which feared confrontation and was hiding in its ports. At that time, the Royal Navy was huge, and it still had sufficient reserves to maintain a naval presence in the North Sea and elsewhere, as well as in the Baltic. Air power was not a major factor at that time. Submarines were also relatively limited. There was a mine barrier in the Great Belt, which the Danes had laid under German pressure, but you could send minesweepers in to deal with it. Well, I think it's a far-fetched idea at best. And interestingly, and this is something only discovered quite recently, Churchill himself came up with some of the strongest arguments against this scenario. He wrote in 1913 in a memorandum which was mainly about Britain's sea defences. I've never seen it quoted anywhere, but again, I'm grateful to the Churchill Archive Centre. He wrote in 1913, "It is difficult to find any sea front of greater natural defensive strength than the German North Sea coast. Borkum and Sylt are both heavily defended by batteries, minefields, and strong garrisons, and both can be commanded by fire from the mainland." He was saying exactly the opposite in 1914. And then he went on, "In any attempt to control the entrances to the Baltic, nothing effective could be done, or still less maintained, without violating the neutrality of Norway or Denmark, or both." So Churchill himself had these insights, which he then somehow suppressed or ignored. And I think it was true also with Operation Catherine in 1939. Well, again, I think more feasibly perhaps, in 1940, it might have been possible for an Allied force to establish itself on the Norwegian coast or on the northern Swedish iron ore fields. It might have been possible to tempt Germany into a war of attrition in the north. Yes, it might have been possible if Churchill's colleagues had been prepared to ride roughshod over Scandinavian neutrality. That's what Hitler did. It worked for him. But could a country claiming to be fighting for democracy against dictatorship do the same thing? They obviously didn't think so. We might agree with them. Ironically, the one intervention that did succeed was in 1919-20, when the Royal Navy contributed decisively to Estonian and Latvian independence. But that, of course, is the exception that proves the rule, since there was no German navy to worry about at that time, nor really any Russian navy either. And of course, ironically, at that time, Churchill was not First Lord of the Admiralty, but Secretary of State for War. So I'm afraid it was far too often action for action's sake. Sometimes his boldness and ingenuity could make breakthroughs. His sponsorship of the tank, perhaps, in the First World War is an example. But we know from bitter experience that wars are won more by attrition than by brilliant diversionary strategies. Well, I come to my final question and my final slide. And this is why I gave the dates 1887 to 1960. They reinforce the fact that Churchill never actually made it to the Baltic, though perhaps it was always present in his imagination. First, the unhappy 14-year-old left behind. They didn't even tell him they were going. They went to St. Petersburg. It was left to his school teacher, I guess, to tell him that they'd gone. And how nice it would have been to visit the land of green and blue, which he must have got from some school book. And then, secondly, the 86-year-old whose trip to the Baltic in Aristotle Onassis' yacht had to be cancelled when Gary Power's U-2 aircraft was shot down over the Soviet Union on the 1st of May 1960. It would have been quite a good trip, I think, and they'd have come back through the Yetta Canal. It sounds great fun, said his secretary, and again, that never happened. Well, returning to the question, was he right or wrong? And I think it's important to emphasise at this point that free access to the Baltic was not just a personal obsession on Churchill's part. It was a long-standing British interest. It dated back to the 17th century, and it, of course, had mostly to do with securing naval supplies, timber and tar, but later it became a matter of preventing the Baltic from being dominated by one or more powers, either Russia or Germany, or the two powers in combination, preventing, in other words, the Baltic from becoming a closed sea, a mare clausum. Admittedly, command of the Baltic was less central to British security than preventing hostile power from gaining control of the Low Countries. It was also less visible, because for long periods British fleets did not patrol there. But the Royal Navy operated in the Baltic when it needed to, whether during the Napoleonic Wars or the Crimean War, and the threat that it might do so was always there. Fisher, above all, exercised that threat when he spoke of Copenhagening the High Seas Fleet at its base, just as Nelson had done with the destruction of the Danish fleet in 1801, and that did definitely act as a deterrent. But, of course, operating in the Baltic depended on a number of factors which were not present in Churchill's lifetime. Keeping the Danish Straits open in war, having bases in the Baltic from which the Royal Navy could operate, having no or only a very weak German Navy, having no German Air Force, and so on. But Churchill's basic analysis was correct. The security of the Baltic and the wider Scandinavian region was a vital British interest then, and it remains a vital interest to this day. Circumstances, of course, have changed. In some respects, they've changed for the better in ways that would have been unimaginable until very recently. With one exception, every state bordering on the Baltic is now a democracy. Many of them are among the most successful societies on earth. And with that same one exception, all of them are members of a single defensive alliance. That is quite extraordinary. It's a totally unprecedented situation, of course, wholly positive. At the same time, the situation is more ominous than it has been for many decades. And the basic problem remains unchanged. In this respect, I think Churchill offers no clear guidance. The Russia of today is not the imperial Russia he knew in his youth, nor a revolutionary Russia bent on spreading world revolution, nor the Russia of Stalin, which he tried first to appease and later to contain, although it contains, of course, elements of all these eras. I won't even try to define what Russia is today, but I think one can say that it is weaker in many ways than the Russia of the past, but stronger in others, and is also behaving in ways that would not even have been attempted by most of those earlier versions. And for this kind of Russia, I'm afraid Churchill has no answers, as he didn't really have answers for the Russia he was dealing with. But one thing he never did was to underestimate Russia's importance. Neither should we. Russia exists, and in one way or other it has to be dealt with. It will not go away. And surely, with all our resources and all our ingenuity, we don't need to rely on Churchill to tell us what we ought to be doing. We can work that out for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was fantastic. Why don't you join me for a quick Q&A session, because we still have about 15 minutes for a nice discussion. Let me ask the first question, because I have the microphone. So you, as a true Britisher, you talked about the big Baltic, right? Where is Germany, there is Russia, there is somewhere Swedes there, the big picture, things that matter. But many of the people here, they come from the small Baltic, in the Eastern Baltic. And I was wondering, what was Churchill's, if any, attitude towards the potential independence of the three Baltic states after the First World War? At the time when, diplomats like Grant Watson were roaming the Baltic states, and he was calling the Lithuanians, for instance, this, quote, this cheerful race of agriculturalists rearing their famous geese, end of quote. Did Churchill have any views at all on this?
Yeah, he did. Is it still working, the mic? He definitely did. And of course, his views changed all the time because the situation was changing all the time. And a lot of the time, it was the prospect, what they were trying to do was to get a new Russia in that was a white Russia of some sort. A Russia that would treat its minorities better than Imperial Russia had done. And certainly at one point, he's saying, let's try to persuade the Baltic states to go in with that sort of arrangement and perhaps produce a federation of the three states under the aegis of the Greater Russia. And he said something like, they might as well do it because they're not going to get it any other way. You know, that's the best they're going to get out of it. And at other points, as the other, in line with really what his colleagues were saying was, let's not let them make a deal with the Soviets. Let's not get a situation where they make peace separately with the Soviet Union, or the Bolsheviks rather. We want to keep them in play as long as possible. So he thought about the Baltic states. I mean, I was saying earlier, I don't think he had a clear image of them, as he maybe even less of a clear image than he did of other countries in the region. But they were, in my impression, is purely an instrument. You know, you use them as best you can to achieve your strategic objectives. I think his view of Finland was a bit different because he knew Finland a bit better. Finland was, of course, a more established state under the Russian Empire. The Baltics, I don't think. I mean, in the hierarchy, they're relatively low, I suspect, but not negligible.
Mm. Thank you. Okay, so let's have some questions from the audience. Who would like to? Yes, Charles.
Could you just talk a little bit about the attitude of Churchill immediately after 1945 to the sending back of refugees from the former Soviet Union, many of them from the Baltic states, and them being returned, often against their will? This is a very controversial aspect of history, and I just wondered if you could comment on Churchill's own attitudes on that question.
Right. I mean, my quick answer is I can't. I don't know enough about that, and I've never seen any view expressed by Churchill on that subject. I'm going to be sort of sticking my neck out here through ignorance, really, but I mean, the country most involved in this is Sweden. I mean, they did appease much more directly than anybody else did. We appeased Russia in other respects, and also we appeased Yugoslavia, Tito, in other respects, by sending back Chetniks and others. And of course, you know, there's the awful business of people in those camps in Austria and so on, and the whole decision about whether they should go back or not. My feeling is that there weren't enough Balts in the British Isles or in British control to worry about. I don't think it would have been, I don't even know how far it entered anybody else's consciousness, actually, in Britain. I simply don't know, so people might be able to answer that question.
Yes, Brendan.
Thank you very much. That was a terrific lecture. A question to do with Churchill's interest in the unorthodox, in action. You mentioned that at the beginning of your lecture, and that he's always thinking of ways of doing things. And it was famously, I can't remember who it was who said this, might have been Alan Brooke, might have been somebody else, that, you know, Churchill has 100 ideas a day, but one or two only are any good. But how involved was he later in the war in, the bombing campaign in the Baltic Sea, thinking of the attacks on Königsberg, Rostock, Lübeck, but also supporting, say, resistance groups in the Western Baltic, in Denmark and places like that. I know he took a big interest in what was happening, say, in Yugoslavia. Was he also so focused on the Baltic?
I think that I'll probably have to give the same sort of question based on ignorance, because, of course, he was very supportive of resistance in general, especially in Western Europe, in France, Norway, and so on. And he certainly had views, or was influenced, on the other great issue, which was not the Baltic, but Yugoslavia. Who do you support in Yugoslavia? Do you support the partisans or the Chetniks? And of course, there was that famous decision really to go for Tito and not the Chetniks, which was very much based on personalities, who was there and who wasn't. Bill Deakin, his research assistant, was there. I think Randolph Churchill was there at one point. Even in war, all these people were down in the Balkans with Tito. So the Chetniks were sidelined and eventually, eliminated from the discussion. Again, I'll use this as an excuse to talk about something I didn't talk about, which was Churchill's interest in various offensive operations in the Northern Sphere throughout the Second World War. And if you read General Alan Brooke's diary, which is a great read because he's so annoyed with Churchill, he's so irritated by him for so much of his life, Alan Brooke was spending most of his time trying to head Churchill off crazy schemes for invading Norway, Operation Jupiter and all this sort of stuff. And Churchill had this idea, he said it, I will roll up the map of Europe from the north, because that's where Hitler began. Churchill remained obsessed with these sorts of operations, which, again, rather as in the First World War, were a huge diversion of staff time and attention on the part of very busy and very tired men to stop Churchill going in for mad schemes. That isn't really an answer, because again, I don't feel that the Baltic, Königsberg was German, so you bomb a German city, but I'm not sure that the Baltic entered his consciousness any more than any other part of the world, and probably less than many others.
Yes, Karel.
Kaarel Piirimäe of the University of Tartu. Churchill was also someone who believed in personal diplomacy, and he was actually the guy who invented the word or the term summitry. And Roosevelt even described him as someone who is desperate to make these deals directly with Stalin. He flew personally to Moscow to make the percentage deal in 1944. And he also believed that the Cold War issues could be solved by a summitry. So if we play the game again, what would he say now to the Americans?
Karel, by the way, is not just a civilian. He wrote a book on Churchill, actually.
I examined his PhD thesis. So I do know that. That's the question I was trying to avoid answering, actually, Karel, because I think I said at the end, I don't think we can guess what Churchill would have thought. One thing he was trying to do, and you've just said it, was to maintain dialogue. And what he was trying to do in his second term as Prime Minister was to organise summits, and he really thought there was a prospect that you could somehow do deals. There's a lot of wishful thinking with Churchill, and there's a lot of wishing that, Stalin is just a chap you can deal with. On the other hand, his wishful thinking in relation to Stalin is less wishful than Roosevelt's. Roosevelt really did think that he and Stalin could be buddies and could gang up against Britain, basically. So Churchill wasn't exactly naive. And of course, above all, he wasn't stupid. Every time he was saying something, he would also have had something else in his mind. And when he was talking about the possibility of working with Stalin, he would always be thinking, these people have murdered thousands of Polish officers. Can I deal with these people? All those things would always be in his mind. But I think what you're saying is, there was always he always held out the possibility that you could still talk to people. I don't know what we say about the present situation.
Darius.
I would like to ask about the non-recognition policy of the Baltic states' incorporation into the Soviet Union. I noticed that in Potsdam Final Declaration, thanks to British position, letters Lithuania, SSR were dropped, actually, and Stalin signed the final declaration. There was a paragraph on Königsberg with Lithuania, SSR. And the British position was to drop those letters, otherwise it would be recognition of incorporation in the Soviet Union. So what was Churchill's view on non-recognition policy?
I think I'm going to probably direct you to Karel sitting just behind you on this subject, but what they had to do, they were going for the minimalist as they could get away with it. So what they did not go for was de jure recognition. They did not recognise legally the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union, but they did recognize it de facto. They just accepted that you could do nothing about it, therefore you have to deal with the situation as it is. Americans took a slightly different position. Swedes took a very different position, as you know. And one thing they did do, as everybody will know, was to allow the three legations to retain their existence in London, and they actually appeared in a separate little section of the diplomatic list, not as fully accredited embassies, but they were still there, and that was the best they could get away with. And I think there is another whole area which I suppose one could go into, and that is the question of the degree to which Britain then supported liberation movements in the Baltic states after the end of the war. You know, the various attempts that were made to infiltrate agents back into the Baltic and so on. There is a literature on that which I'm not really up to date with. But I'm pretty sure that the secret vote, the secret service vote, and I don't think I'm saying anything untoward here, because I think it's well known, was used to support those legations throughout the post-war period. And of course they were able to reconstitute their existence when the Baltic states regained their independence in 1991. I haven't answered your question completely, but I think it's in that's the sort of area we're looking at.
We have time for one more question, but it has to be good. One more. Yes.
John Saropoulos from Al Jazeera. Greeks remember very well that it was thanks to Winston Churchill that Greece received military assistance against the communist uprising in 1944, and that ultimately ended in the defeat of the Communist Party of Greece's bid to take over the country by force. Do we know when Churchill made that decision and why?
I think my answer to that is that in Churchill's mind, Greece was always the exception. Whatever else you did, Greece would not fall under Soviet control. And you remember the sort of famous percentages agreement, whenever that was signed between Churchill and the piece of paper which had the percentages on it. Greece was always going to be in the British sphere. And it's interesting that all those statements, like the Fulton speech and the one I quoted from May 1945, he always says the whole of Eastern Europe, with the exception of Greece. You know, Greece is the bit at the bottom which hasn't fallen under Soviet control, and Greece is one of the longest-serving British interests in the Mediterranean. It goes back to Greek independence at the beginning of the 19th century. Britain only had. There are only two countries between the war where Britain had a naval advisor permanently based. One was Greece, and the other was Finland. Which, again, I'm jumping around a bit, but that makes me always think that Finland actually had a rather separate status, a rather higher status in British thinking than the Scandinavian states or the Baltic states. Finland was somehow a viable state on the edge of the Soviet Union, one that you want to deal with and keep as a listening post as much as anything else. And Greece, I think, is not quite the same, of course, but Greece is always, in Churchill's mind, and I think in the British mind, always part of the British sphere. And they would do a lot, and Churchill did do a lot. He was there in Greece, bolstering resistance to the communists. And Stalin, maybe for his part, did not support the communists. I don't know enough about this, but I have a suspicion that Stalin actually respected the percentage deal, and it was the Greek communists, rather than acting on their own behalf, rather than at Stalin's behest, that led to their civil war. Again, that's not an answer, but it's a few thoughts.
Patrick, thank you so much. That was truly excellent. What a fine ending for a fine conference.